Hi everyone, this is Mason Christensen, archivist at the Dearborn Historical Museum, and today for this video I'm going to be talking about Maplewood Park, which was East Dearborn's first subdivision. During the 1800s and into the early 1900s, East Dearborn was largely just farmland. You didn't have any large housing developments, there was no big commercial developments. The only real exception was at the northeast corner of Michigan and Schaefer, you had the Schaefer Tavern operating there. It really took until more investment came into the area for that status to change. Henry Ford coming into the Dearborn area was really the big event that changed the destiny of what is now East Dearborn. Henry Ford and his associates started buying land in the Dearborn area around 1907, 1908. He completes Fairlane, his mansion, by 1915, and he's got big plans in the works. He's talking about building a tractor plant. First, they build the one there over in West Dearborn, but it's rumored that he's going to be building one at the site of the Rouge plant. So, because of Ford coming into the Dearborn area, there's grand plans for, the region. So, another proposed project that affected the development of East Dearborn was the creation of a new Detroit Zoo. So, back in 1913, the Detroit Zoological Society actually purchased land around the corner of Michigan and Greenfield, stretching down to the Rouge, that was to be a new Detroit Zoo. It was going to be a fairly grandiose project. They were talking about even improving the Rouge River so that passenger steamers could get up from downtown Detroit to the new zoo property. And in several subdivisions that were launched fairly early in Dearborn, the prospect of the Detroit Zoo being nearby was used as a selling point. Unfortunately, that project didn't really go very far. The land in 1916 is actually sold to Ford, and the Detroit Zoological Society ends up using some of that money to help purchase land in Royal Oak, where the current site of the zoo is. So, with all of Ford's developments that are proposed in their initial stages, and with the Detroit Zoo being proposed, suddenly there's a greater demand for housing in what is now East Dearborn. Back in 1915, the Hannon Real Estate Exchange Company, which was a very big Detroit firm, they actually acquired land at the northwest corner of Michigan Avenue and Schaefer, basically stretching from Ford Road down to Michigan Avenue from Schaefer over to what is now Horger Street. They lay out the Maplewood Park subdivision. And this is going to be the first real major subdivision in the East Dearborn area. So the Maplewood Park subdivision actually sold out quite fast. From what I understand, most of the lots in the subdivision sold within a month to both, people wanting to build houses, to speculators, and so on. But having all your lots sell out within a month is pretty unheard of, and it really helped start a boom to what is now East Dearborn. The Hannon Real Estate Exchange Company, they got started into a bunch of other little subdivisions nearby, including a Maplewood Park addition. A bunch of other real estate firms in the Detroit area started developing subdivisions in the East Dearborn area, and it, helped really trigger a huge real estate boom. The Hannon real estate firm, actually, it's also notable that they also, later on into the 20s, they were the ones responsible for Dearborn Hills and the West Dearborn area as well. One thing that we have in the collection of the Dearborn Historical Museum that talks about the history of neighborhoods are property abstracts, and they are incredible documents that really tell you all sorts of details, tell you about land transaction history, tell you about legal terminology and the like that affects that neighborhood. So for Maplewood Park, we actually have two abstracts in our collection, one related to a commercial building and one related to a house in the neighborhood. And I want to talk a little bit more about those documents. One Maplewood Park property abstract that we have is for what is now Peacock Indian Restaurant at 13736 Michigan. Besides having the property transaction history, it has a lot of restrictions on it that talk about with the land sale, what sort of building can be constructed there. So with that property, it was supposed to be a store building to be not less than 2 stories in height, to be constructed of brick veneer, or stucco exterior, to cost not less than at least $2,500 at the time. It's not supposed to be a manufacturing spot or a house at all. It's not supposed to sell alcohol there. It's not supposed to have cement block exteriors. Any signs, posters, billboards, etc., are supposed to be only on display with the permission of the seller of the land. So there's a lot of kind of strict terms here. Its style of building in all cases shall be met with the approval of the first party. So they're very kind of restrictive in what sorts of buildings can be constructed there. This is pretty typical. So the museum also has a property abstract for what is now 5459 Maple Street, a duplex in the Maplewood Park subdivision. And it's interesting because in the restrictions, it mentions that only a single private residence of the bungalow or semi-bungalow type, to not cost less than $2,000 and to be set back at least 25 feet from the front lot line, shall be constructed on the site. As you can tell from the current building there, these were not entirely followed. This doesn't really look very bungalow-like to me, and certainly not a private residence. So, obviously the terms with this, the land is being initially sold off in 1915, and it's being sold. The lots are being sold several times, so restrictions aren't necessarily being enforced later on. You do see in a few subdivisions, like in the Fort Homes, things like selling alcohol. Those terms would actually be restricted. I know at least one person in the Fort Homes subdivision was kicked out of their house because they were selling illegal wine down there. So at least in some subdivisions, these restrictions did get enforced. So it's also interesting in the restrictions of this property abstract, like the one for the commercial building, that cement block is not supposed to be used. They're obviously mentioning alcohol in here as well. No signs. But it's one thing that's missing that's in a lot of property abstracts for Dearborn, unfortunately, is restrictions on race. And there's at least one I came across that mentioned like no person of an Ethiopian ancestry can move into this house. The thing is, this development is being done so early back in 1915 when these original restrictions are being drawn up. There's not a particularly large African American population in the Detroit area, but only a few years later that would pretty dramatically change. Just to conclude this video, I wanted to note that before Maplewood Park came around as a subdivision, there were really no major developments in what is now East Dearborn. But only within a couple of years, you go from having no subdivisions to subdivisions left and right. The village of Springwells ends up incorporating in 1919. You have all the Springwells Township school districts uniting that same year into what basically became Fordson School District. Only a few years later, you have Springwells becoming a city in 1924. You have it renaming itself Fordson. And very quickly, by the late 20s, you have a good 30,000+ people here in an area where you just had a few farmers before 1915.